Hello, Montana, and hello, world. This is Chris Hislop, the Executive Director of the Montana World Affairs Council, and this is Connect Montana, where we bring the world to Montana and Montana to the world. We're midway through our spring series of Connect Montana. If you missed any of the previous 5 events, including our last event, which featured former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, you can find those events and the other 50 plus on our YouTube channel. Of course, we couldn't bring this quality of event to you without the generous support of our sponsors. I'd like to thank the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Stockman Bank, and Allegiance. For the participants out there today, I want to remind you of a couple things. My colleague, Yuli, will be chatting in messages during the event to ask you if you would like to receive more information and offering some useful links. So please have a look inside the chat box and Yuli will be in touch with you. And keep in mind, in the format for the show is our guest will speak for, say, 15 to 20 minutes, and then it will be open for question and answer by you, the participants. Please use the chat function, chat in your questions to me. I'll curate those and I will be then asking Professor Tamir those that are relevant to the topic today. Now, let me introduce today's guest. We are extremely pleased to welcome Professor Yael Tamir, who is the president of Schenker College and an adjunct professor at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. Representing the Labor Party, she served as Israel's Minister of Immigration and as Minister of Education, as well as the Deputy Speaker of the Knesset and a member of the Finance Committee, the Education Committee, and the Security and Foreign Affairs Committee. Professor Tamir received her BA and MA from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and her PhD in political philosophy from Oxford University. She was a professor at Tel Aviv University and a scholar in residence at Princeton, Harvard, the European University in Florence, the Central European University in Budapest, NYU, and Penn. Professor Tamir is the recipient of numerous academic awards. She is the author of Liberal Nationalism, as well as numerous articles in the fields of moral and political philosophy, philosophy of education, feminism, and human rights. She's the editor of Democratic Education in a Multicultural State, and with Professor Macedo, Moral and Political Education. Her recent book, Why Nationalism, has been published by Princeton University Press. Professor Tamir is a founding member of the Israeli peace movement, Peace Now, and served as the chairperson of the Association of Civil Rights in Israel. Professor Tamir, welcome to Connect Montana. It's so nice to have you coming to us all the way from Israel. How are you?
Very well. I hope I could fly over, but
one of these days, we hope so too.
One of those days.
Professor, I wanted to kick off by making a note that in our promotions and advertisement of this event on social media, we got a lot of chatter, which is always very interesting to hear, people's thoughts and opinions on upcoming events and the topics. Now, some of that chatter was somewhat negative regarding, I think, the term nationalism. But you have a very different take. You speak and write about nationalism that is, quote, essential to democracy at its best. I wonder if you could share with our guests a little bit more of your perspective. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm well aware of the fact that nationalism is a very problematic concept. And even when I wrote my dissertation way back in the 80s, and I wrote it on nationalism, everybody advised me to let it go and say, well, write about communitarianism, write about, find a more friendly term so people will be able to accommodate it. Luckily, I had my great supervisor, Sarah Zahar Berlin, standing by my side and saying, no, the issue is nationalism and there's no way of, avoiding it. Now, for me, nationalism, like every other political concept, is a complex concept. It could be interpreted in many different ways. Some of them are horrific, as we all know, but some of them, and those are the one I'm interested in because they were highly neglected, are very important for the understanding of the modern democratic welfare state. And my argument is that without a sense of unity, without a sense of peoplehood, there is no social contract. In order to sign a social contract, which is the basis of our democratic thinking, we need to have something in common. We need to share destiny. We need to care for each other. Nationalism is especially important in creating this precondition for us working together in order to create a community. Now, that community could be virtuous. It could be, as I said, zealous and and horrific. It's up to us what kind of communities we create. But without a community, without a state that is based on a notion of acknowledgement that we are in it together, I think democracy can function. I think welfare state can function. The good things that we get from the state are dependent on our identity as fellow citizens, as members in the same community. And that's why nationalism is very important.
So, Professor, I mean, maybe I could ask you to just expand a little bit more on that, because you note that it's a kind of precondition for community. But I suppose it depends in large part what people consider those preconditions are and what they would agree to. Looking around the world, when we talk about nationalism, oftentimes I think we look at the pre-war period, and then we look at a more recent period where we hear that nationalism has reemerged in a more negative sense. So in the more positive sense, as a precursor or precondition for our democracy, how do you actually forge that kind of unity or that kind of that community? How do people come around together on this, despite they may be from very different backgrounds?
Well, let's take, I think, some positive examples. Let's think about the Nordic countries, who are very nationalistic. If we ever spend time in either Finland, Denmark, Sweden, nations we think are actually just, communitarian in the good sense of the word, have a great welfare state, and are, probably quite a symbol of democratic life. A lot of them guided by and governed by women. These states tie together what I think is the essence of the kind of nationalism that is important for us. They have an identity that is very clear. They have a welfare state grounded in that identity. And the connection is not only that we are in it together, that we are in it together for a transgenerational contract. I think the important thing to understand when you think about either welfareism or environmentalism, we have to create transgenerational commitments. If we all live in one place and then move to another and then move to another, why should I care, for example, about an education system if my children are not going to grow there? Why should my children care about a pension system if I'm not going to get older in this place? There is a certain continuity that makes us able to care, and it makes it rational for us, even if we are, as Rawls claim, self-interested. It makes it rational for us to think about not only ourselves, but of people who we care about and people who are going to be or could be in our position, not only today, but tomorrow and the day after tomorrow or in the next generation. So when you look at sort of, if you want to call it that way, I'm not sure, good nationalisms, you see it in many welfare states. You see it in Australia, you see it in New Zealand, you see it in Finland, you see it in many other places that I think are exemplary of where I would like us to be.
Maybe I could pick that one up, Professor Tamir, just on the Nordic example, which is a really interesting one. I think it would be easy to jump to some very surface conclusions about what characteristics might bring people together. But surely there are some deeper characteristics within Nordic society that foster and support this kind of transgenerational identity. So it's not simply that you have a predominantly or overwhelmingly Anglo white population, predominantly a certain religious group, but surely there are other characteristics undergirding those that may in fact be more important than what lives on the surface. Could you share some thoughts on that?
Obviously, every country is different. When we speak about global phenomena like nationalism or socialism or liberalism, they're very, American liberalism and European liberalism and Israeli liberalism have very little in common. The place where you enact your ideology influences a lot the ideology. I use the Nordic state as an example just because I think they are very openly both nationalistic and inclined to develop the welfare state. And they are very particular societies. They are small. They used to be homogeneous. They're no longer homogeneous as they used to be. They have a long religious tradition that makes them more modest, less consumer-oriented, more egalitarian. So there's a lot that works for them. But still, I think the things that keep them together are very much along the lines of what we call nationalism, national pride, national identity. Lots of surveys from recent years in the Nordic states, but also in many other European states of what do you feel your identity is? Is it European or is it local, Danish, Finnish, whatever? Most people there feel much more localized than not only globalized, but even Europeanized. So I would not say that their nationalism is similar to the one that emerged in Israel or in India or in other places. But I think it just because of this, it's such a clear example, it is easier to see the way it works. There are other examples that I also think are very important. I think the New Deal, think about the New Deal in America. Think about the language of the New Deal. I don't know, I'm sort of following from afar Biden. I don't know whether he's trying to recreate a New Deal. But this assumption that we must work and be in it together, and it usually emerges after a crisis because we all feel very vulnerable after crises. So we are maybe more open to reenacting our collective deal. I think those are the good parts that makes us stick together and work for the welfare of others within our society and probably also across borders.
Thanks a lot for that, Professor. Now, I'm just going to have a quick pause and encourage our participants to chat in questions to Professor Tamir on this very interesting take on an issue on nationalism. She has written a book called Why Nationalism and is sharing with us her views on different elements of that in a much more positive light than I think we often associate with the term nationalism. I mean, you said it yourself in your introduction that your advisor said, you have to do this. This is the issue, despite the fact it's sometimes perceived differently. It's a very interesting term you use, the transgenerational point of this. Now, I will admittedly stereotype the generation younger than I, whom, is much more active on, can we call them transnational issues, transnational threats, who are looking at climate change, who are looking at human rights, human trafficking, and things like this, not from a kind of national standpoint, but certainly from a more global standpoint. So does the transgenerational aspect of your view, is it changing within the current younger generation, say, younger than 30, who are although I don't have the surveys at hand regarding Europeans, but I generally get the sense that younger people are less associated and less certain about a national identity and more associating themselves with either a regional, say, European identity or even a global identity. How does that affect your perspective on nationalism, if at all?
Yeah, well, it affects it. I'm not so sure that, it's a question of age. I think it's a question in different periods in one's life, and also in different periods of our civilization or human existence, we are more and less aware of identities, whether local or global. I don't think any one of us is 100% global or 100% local. All of us have a sort of a combination between the two. You know, when you run a survey, comparative survey, who are the most globalist nations? Could you guess?
Good question. Who is
One
it?
guess.
Okay, one guess. The most globalist nation. I'm going to go with Switzerland.
No, you're wrong. Actually, Switzerland is very low. The most globalist nation, where across generation people want to have an open world, is Ghana. Why? Because people want to immigrate out of it. And they don't see their future in that country. The more wealthy nations are more nationalist because they think that they have something to preserve.
Indeed.
And it is also connected to the fact that you feel proud about your nation and feel proud about, you know, your existence as a community. So I don't know. We're all, as I. So if we live in a place that is broken down, it's corrupt, and we have no future, a lot of us and develop a more sort of globalist tendencies because we want a way out. If we live in a good society where we manage as a community to make it more stable, more able to support us, then we're more localized. Most people at the end of the day, I'll ask you another question. I'm sorry, you are my son.
Oh, please.
The person I communicate with. What is the percentage of people around the globe who live in the country that they were not born in?
They were not born in. I would say less than 15.
I would say 4.
Oof. Okay.
So if you are a rational person, you know your fate is connected with that of your community. That does not mean that you should ignore the misery and needs of others. But it means that if you are a rational person, I'm trying to claim that nationalism is the rational solution. It's not the irrational, romantic thing about, glory and blood and flags and ceremony. This is the rational way. If I am a rational person and I want to care for the future of my children and grandchildren, from the future of my community, for my own well-being, I should know that it is highly connected. And I think the corona exemplified it very well, the COVID-19 pandemic. It is highly connected with my society. It is reasonable, rational, and preferable for me to make it better. Again, this does not mean that I should be aloof to other needs, but it makes it something real for our lives. Now, a lot of people, and I don't know the age split about nationalism, I know the country split very well, but not the age split. A lot of young people don't feel sometimes less vulnerable than, we oldies. We know how many troubles we are going to face, how many troubles they are going to face. They don't know it yet. And feel maybe more interested in moving around. They realize, and that's part, I think, of the disenchantment with globalism, that moving around is not easy, that most people, either the most desperate or the most talented will make it. And most of us, the normal people in between, are going to live where we were born. And it is rational and preferable for us to understand how we can make it a better place to live in. Now, if you think about it a little bit like the invisible hand argument, if all of us will work for our countries to be better, it will be a better world.
That's an incredible incredible figure, the 4% figure. We are now getting some questions in on the chat function, Professor Tamir, and I want to encourage our participants and listeners to please take this opportunity to learn more about Professor Tamir's perspective and this interesting view on well, call it nationalism, but it sounds like it's much, much richer than that. So, Professor, here's a question from one of our participants. When national identities are defined by differences with others rather than by similarities within the nation, isn't that when trouble starts?
Yes, it is. But I think that's the way we live. We are unable, really unable, to live without creating a sense of identity, or it would be a sort of almost a pathological situation if we have no identity. And the moment you have an identity, it is created against something. As Montesquieu said, I've traveled the world, I've met Persian, and I met French people, and I met all sorts of people. I've never met a man, never met a woman either. As someone who's so detached from their identity that he's so universalized that you don't know who they are. There is a wonderful exchange between Einstein and Freud, between the wars. And Einstein asked Freud, why war continues? He says, why are we so particularistic? And Freud says, I'm sure you're right. You remember then Einstein was a pacifist and a globalist. And he says, I'm sure you're right. I'm sure a world better governed would be one that everybody sheds their identity and lives together as one community. But it is beyond our psychological means. And in that sense, I'm a Freudian. I think that's who we are as individuals. We don't know. So the question is, once we have defined ourselves, and it's always against other identity, what do we do with this definition? Again, my claim is don't ignore the things that happen to us just because you think they are bad. Acknowledge them. Understand when they're going to grow sour and deal with them rather than, just put them under the carpet and speak the language of, global identity, which I don't think exists.
And just picking up on that one would be a question from me. When do we know that a perception of nationalism is turning sour? When do we know that rather than it being a more positive unifying concept, it starts to tilt in a more negative direction? What are the pointers, milestones, and indicators?
I think it turns sour when we see nationalism as the only player in the ideological map. That's another thing I've learned from Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin used to say that ideas become very dangerous when they're taken to the logical conclusion. And then you don't see anything else but that. It could happen, by the way, to justice, to liberty, to any ideology could be taken to the extreme. My view is that nationalism is important, it should be taken into account, but it shouldn't be the only ideology that you entertain. I'm a liberal, I'm a feminist, I'm a Zionist, I have many commitments. And the crucial thing is how you balance these different identities. If I was only one thing, I would probably be oppressive to others because that identity would dominate my life. And I will try to dominate their lives in order to make it right as I see it. If I have multiple identities, I acknowledge them and I balance between them, then I am more able to create a just sort of balance. And we never know the perfect balance, which is good because if somebody would have created a recipe for us of the perfect balance, then we would be unnecessary. As moral agents, as political agents, we have to do the balance. It's our responsibility. This is the game we play in order to be able to justify our freedom. But nationalism loses itself when it becomes the only idea that governs a society. But it is when it's balanced and when it is interacting with other ideologies, it makes them, I think, richer. So my only claim is, don't dismiss nationalism. Because when you dismiss it, you lose something that is very important in people's life, in real people's life.
I have the sense maybe you've just answered this next one, but I'm going to put it out there maybe with a slight spin. That one of our participants asks, how does a country cultivate and maintain a rational form of nationalism without it devolving to a more crude and harmful nationalism, like white nationalism in the United States? Is it worth the risk to stoke nationalism when the lowest common denominators in a society may not be rational?
Well, there are two answers. One, I think I sort of answered before. I think ignoring nationalism actually allows people to present the extreme xenophobic version of nationalism as the only versions. And people who are not engaged in more rational, reflective way of thinking say, well, I know who I am. I'm American, I'm Israeli. I know what I want to be. And that's the only option for me to be an American. I think the debate in America, like the debate in Israel, is not about globalism. It's about what a better America is, or what a better Israel is. I mean, it's not about, relinquishing our identities. It's about forming our identities and being active. Governments that want to do it, and this is, it's true for any other ideology. Governments want to do it. Educate children, educate citizens to be aware of identities, but not to be aware only of their identity, because and the fact that we have so many identities that are as a woman, I see other women on the screen, so I have something common in them. Most of them have white hair like mine, so I have something in common with them too. But I am Israeli, so I have commonalities with other people. I'm a socialist. I don't know who's a socialist here on the screen, but so learning that identity is not one thing, yet it is very important. Remember how hard it is and how often we identify with people whose identity is suppressed. And I think one of the things that happened, and maybe I should say one more word about it, we've been so, because of the process where identity formation sort of developed in the 20th century, we used to think that the identity of the majority is secure. It's only minorities or women or Black who have to care about their identity. So we were very sensitive to the way we treated their identity. But then the majority started saying, I don't feel secure. I have an identity too. Offer me a legitimate identity. And if you don't engage in it, if you don't engage in offering a group an identity, somebody else will. And that somebody else will be probably cheap, extreme kind of definition that is easy to adapt. So for me, this is the role of the people who would like to contain nationalism. It's to offer a discourse about identity that does not neglect identity, but balance it against other ideologies.
Yeah, I can really appreciate, your talk about the balance. I mean, certainly that is, true across most things, but particularly here, where you do have to strike a solid balance. Here's another question from our audience. Do you see a difference between nationalism and patriotism? If so, what is the difference?
Yeah, a lot of people like this distinction between nationalism and patriotism. Usually patriotism is the good nationalism, and nationalism is sort of a patriotism going astray. I think they are on a continuum, and being loyal to your country, to your patria, to your fellows, is something common to both nationalism and patriotism. It's a sort of a little bit of the way we treat concepts in order to sort of signal whether we like them or not. And actually the reason I stuck with nationalism is that I want to say, just by calling it nationalism or patriotism doesn't make it any different. Face the realities with the difficulties, with the dangers, and with the promises, and deal with it. So, many countries, it's also a cultural difference. In some countries, there's nothing more nationalistic than French patriotism. If you've ever been in any patriotic event in France, but also in other countries, patriotic events in Israel have been nationalistic. So I think it's a distinction without a difference. There is a difference between different kind of patriotism and nationalism, but within the two, it's an easy way not to deal with a difficult question.
That's very well put. I mean, it makes me think a little bit about some of the tenor of the political rhetoric here in the United States, particularly when you're looking or you're speaking about a balance in a number of things, and that sometimes both messages seem to come together as one. On one hand, appealing to one's nationhood and patriotism, let's say, as an American. We are all Americans, right? We are all in this together, this sense. But at the same time, I would say, or I would like your opinion, it's a very easy political lever to pull to say we are all Americans except for that threat that we are experiencing over here to our existence. And therefore, we have to not have that part be part of our American conception. I mean, it is used as a political lever, obviously. Is it too easy? How can we be better aware of that?
Well, first of all, by learning history and knowing that identities are not permanent. Certainly the American identity is very flexible. You can see how different immigration groups became Americanized, the Italian, for example, or the Irish, or the Jews for that matter. So understanding that identity is flexible is something very important. And it makes you wonder about, it never stops. It's not like, okay, we now concluded what our identity is and it will never change. But it's not an open door, because in order to become Americanized or Israeli or whatever, it takes some effort. And I think it's a welcome effort, because if we, if our society is so diverse that we can't converse with each other because we don't have the same language, we don't have the same political association because we've never learned the same history, we don't have something in common, so we don't care about our, common future, that would be very difficult to run such a society as a democracy. So those things are essential. Remember that I want to remind people something that I think is very essential. Nationalism is the reason why we have public schools. Because people said, well, if you want to have a conversation, by the way, a democratic conversation, you need a language. And we need to converse with each other in a way we understand each other, right? So we have started national education, public education, as a way of establishing a nation. And the nation was then created in order to create basis for a political dialogue that was supposed to allow us to be democratic citizens. And you can't converse in gibberish, and you can't converse in Esperanto. Was a nice experiment to do an international language. It didn't work, and for good reason.
Professor Tamir, what happens when some of those, you spoke of a common past and a common vision for the future. Those can be in disagreement, and you can still have civil discourse, of course, on that. We see that, I'm not just talking about in America, but around the world on questions of racial equity, and what is being taught and what is understood as our past may not be a full reflection of all of us together and of the actual past. How do we understand the coming closer on a common past and a common vision of the future?
Well, first of all, as I said, identity is always on the move and will always disagree. And there's a known Jewish joke about two Jews who disagree about a certain tradition. And they come to the rabbi to ask, what is the tradition in the community? And the rabbi listens to the first Jew and he says, you're right, that's the tradition. Then he listens to the other Jew and he says, you're right, that's the tradition. And they say to him, well, Rabbi, you just said to both of us that that's the tradition. And he said, yes, this debate is the tradition of our community. This is what we debate about. But we debate about it because we care about it. You don't debate with people if you don't care about your identity. You don't ask yourself whether a Lee statue is good or bad if you don't care about America. Those who are for and those who are against are, both of them are engaged in it from a national point of view. They care about the identity of the group. Something it's terrible, something it's wonderful, something it should be tolerated, something, but the debate is what keeps us together. We have a discourse of disagreement, but we care about it together. If we don't, people here in Israel don't even know who General Lee was, and they certainly don't care whether the statue is in the street or no. We have our own debates. Don't think we are free of them. We have many of them, but we don't participate in this debate because it's not our debate. It's yours debate, and in this sense, it's your national debate.
I think that's something very easy to forget in the heat of a debate, of course, when one wants to be completely right and wants to prove somebody else wrong through superior logic or debate, which, I think we see all around the world. Let me pause again quickly, Professor, and invite our participants. We have maybe 5 more minutes to go to chat in any questions that you might have to Professor Tamir. I'd like to ask you another question, if I could. I ask this to everybody because, as you know, a good part of our audience is here in the state of Montana. And Montana has a very interesting national and international perspective on issues. But I always want to know if you could help people here in Montana understand it's a very simple but very complex problem. Why should we care about this? Why in our daily lives when we're living and working and trying to make a living, should we care whether or not we can come together in a balance on a national identity or not?
Well, we care about, about what we teach in school. We care about the tradition we pass to our children. We care about our, the names of the street we live in. Some names make you. I'll tell you a story. I'm a wine lover. I don't know how are the wines in Montana, but I've never actually had one. But if you have some recommendations, then write to me afterwards.
We'll chat it in.
And I have a winery that I buy wine from an Arab village near where I work. And there's a very nice guy, we're very good friends. And I one day I said to him, could you bring me 3 boxes of wine? It's too heavy for me to carry. He says, yes. And I said to him, okay. He says, I'll bring it to your apartment. What's the code to your entrance? And I said, 1948. And he said, I'm not bringing you the wine. Come and get it. And, this is a small thing, that's the code of the house because they're all old people here. That's a number they remember. But this makes your life so uncomfortable when you don't think about those things. And in order to understand this complex existence and the way we treat others and they treat us, we have to think about identity and we have to care about what happens in the public sphere we share, because nobody wants to be embarrassed and use a code that for him is oppressive. It's simple, but it's very essential to people.
Indeed, that's a great story. Thanks for sharing that with us. And of course, it does matter. I mean, I really appreciate that thought and appreciate your views on this balance. I think, I've certainly learned a lot here today, given, what I guess is a kind of knee-jerk reaction towards a negative perception of the term nationalism, where we jump on it very quickly without maybe recognizing some of the unifying elements that you're talking about, and especially the balance. So much appreciated on that, Professor. I wonder, hold on, I just got one more question, excuse me. Can you elaborate on the quote unquote invisible hand can solve difficult global problems such as climate change?
What I said is that if all of us try to make, our country cleaner, if we all try to use, green technologies, green energy, and so on, the world will be better. And it will be the invisible hand at the time thought about individuals. If all of us work for our own interest, the interest of all of us will flourish. I think in the same way, if each country will do its best for its own sake, but also for others, the accumulative effort will be much more useful. At the end of the day, we need everybody around the globe to work together, but the mediating framework that does it is the state and the nation, the nations. And that's, we need a United Nations. That's what we need in order to solve problems. We can't do it on our own, but we need to do it through our political entities, who I think work best when they're nation states.
Well, thanks a lot for that, Professor. I mean, this is one of the best parts of this show is when we can get an entirely new perspective on something we think we know a lot about, but end up, learning so much. So I want to thank you. I want to just pass it back to you for any final thoughts or comments that you might have for us here in Montana.
I think that my message is always the same. I think that decent people should fight for a decent nationalism and not overlook it, because that's the only way we're going to have a decent society that care for the future of all of us. And I have children and grandchildren. I want them to do well, and I'm ready to sacrifice quite a lot for their well-being. And I do it through a state that I try to convince, unfortunately not very successfully, to be more humane and more just. And I don't know any other way I could make a difference.
Hear, hear. Thanks a lot for that, Professor Tamir. And let me just say a few words now in wrapping up. First is to thank you, Professor, and to thank our guests. And I also want to thank the sponsors for our work here, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank. A reminder to everybody, next up on Connect Montana is Tuesday, March 23rd, and we're back to the 6 p.m., the evening slot. We changed it here in order to take into account Professor Tamir's time change, but we're back next Tuesday evening, 6 p.m., with Tsneo Akaha. He is an academic who's looking at East Asia in transition, the U.S. and Japan relation, and that's together with the National Consortium for Teaching About Asia. For those of you who might be new to the Montana World Affairs Council, check us out on the web, montanaworldaffairs.org, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and we have a YouTube channel. We've had a lot of different shows on many different topics. You can check those out there. Drop us a line if you like. Let us know what you think about the show and our programs at info@montanaworldaffairs.org. Also, let us know if you want to get more information, get on the events mailing list. And so, once again, Professor, I thank you very kindly for joining us on the show. Much appreciated, much appreciated. And thank you to all of the participants. Wishing you all well. Goodbye.